Whoa, what is this? An intro done by Andy. Dan's off for vacation this week, and graciously joining us here on Real Pod Wednesdays is your wonderful Skull Session writer, Chase Brown. Chase, thanks for coming on and filling in for the legendary Don Hope.
I'm excited to be here. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you, Andy. It'll be fun.
We're going to chat it up here. It's a slow time of year. I don't think that's any secret. You know, the off season for us as writers is sometimes a space to either work on stories we've kind of had in the back burner for a while, do some of those more slow burning pieces, or maybe just try and find things to fill space because there isn't as much to talk about. And I think, you know, this wasn't the busiest week for Ohio State. Certainly some interesting things going on. But I think overall, this has been a pretty slow time of the season, and that's been reflected some by Ohio State's transfer portal moves or lack thereof. But they did add one spring transfer portal addition this week in safety. Keenan Nelson Jr. out of South Carolina. Chase, thoughts on what Ohio State has done or hasn't done in the portal thus far?
So with Nelson, I think Ohio State gets somebody that really adds depth to that defensive backfield. They lost a couple of players in the winter window and in the spring window, whether it was Cameron Martinez, Jair Brown, Kai Stokes. They lost Jahad Carter in the spring window. I think Ohio State has been looking for guys that may understand that they need some development in their game, and they can get that behind a player like Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs in the secondary. So I'm kind of curious if that was the conversation that Ohio State had with Nelson was, hey, come here, maybe develop for a year or two, and then we can see what we can do with you in our defensive backfield. I think Jim Knowles and Matt Guerrieri have been pretty decisive about what they want in terms of having a guy that can compete on special teams like Nelson and kind of cut his teeth, as Ryan Day always says, and sort of earn his stripes here at Ohio State. So I think Nelson is a good player that Ohio State's added. I'm kind of curious to see what they may do at other positions moving forward too.
Right. And, you know, Keenan isn't a guy who played a lot at South Carolina last year. Only he did appear in 11 games, but only had 9 tackles, wasn't a starter. And it really didn't feel like you were going to get that type of player to come. And, you know, the offer here is, like you said, to be a backup and to develop over time and maybe be the guy next year after Lathan Ransom leaves, depending on how you compete with the other guys in the room. Keenan Nelson gives you that as a depth option. You needed bodies more so at safety, and that's what Keenan Nelson provides, and with the potential to develop into something more than that as you move forward. But, you know, this wasn't a defense where, you know, Dana and I talked about it last week, that you didn't need to upgrade any positions. The starters are solved with the exception of Will linebacker, where you've got 2 5-stars battling to start with CJ Hicks and Sonny Styles. So there wasn't a lot on this defense that you looked at and said they need to upgrade here. Safety was the main spot. They needed depth. They're really deep at corner. They're really deep on the D-line. They have depth at linebacker. The offensive side of the football, really the offensive line is where you said, well, maybe they could use an upgrade in the transfer portal. But as it stands now, there's no one in the top 500 spots of 24/7 Sports' transfer portal rankings, player rankings, that's an offensive lineman and uncommitted. So there's no place where Ohio State is really going to be changing its roster now, its lineup, I should say. It might add depth in places, but anything that's going to alter the lineup is done almost by necessity. The only 2 top 100 prospects in those same rankings that are uncommitted are at safety and edge, and Ohio State isn't looking for starters at either of those positions. So the thing that is apparent now is that what Ohio State's head coach Ryan Day said in February about he believes Ohio State had then the talent it needed to go out and win a national championship is ringing true for him. That they didn't need to go and make a bunch of moves in the spring portal. The main objective was retention. They kept all the pieces that were going to play a role this year. You know, a couple depth guys transfer out, but no one that was going to have a clear defined role with this team. And so you're left with what was there after all those big additions in the winter window, after the coaching staff adjustments. I wrote a story about it over the weekend. It's a line in the sand that's been drawn. The personnel that's going to try and achieve Ohio State's goals is set. That's from a coaching and from a player perspective. Now we enter the next phase of things, which is development. Summer workouts, fall camp, let all the talk and the preseason hype build as we kind of ramp up to the season here. But the lack of moves in the spring portal window that has played out for Ohio State is telling about the confidence that the coaching staff has for what this roster can achieve.
What kind of confidence would you say, Andy, you have in the offensive line as it may be currently constructed? I know we still have some questions with the right guard position, but it seems like, if Josh Fryer does stick at that right tackle position, you probably have Seth McLaughlin at center, and you have Donovan Jackson at left guard, and then you have Josh Simmons at left tackle. We maybe have that competition going on between maybe Hinsman plays right guard, maybe Tager Shabola, maybe Luke Montgomery. You have a couple of guys that have been working in at that spot. No matter if it's any of those three guys, what kind of confidence do you have in that offensive line to perform this season?
I'd say there's a moderate confidence. I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic. It's
Sure.
like in the past, obviously, that last year, the offensive line was the top concern going into the season that I had. It was the top concern throughout the season. And then it was the worst part of the team in the Cotton Bowl. Like, we can just say that point blank period. That was one of the worst performances an Ohio State offensive line has ever had. I don't think people are going to shy away from that fact on the team. People that are still, playing for the team that were on that offensive line aren't shying away from how bad that game was. However, there are pieces that can give you a certain level of play. Donovan Jackson is capable of being an All-American, and he's played like it in stretches. He had lapses, whether they were for games or just individual key plays last season, but he's a guy that can be the stalwart cornerstone of an offensive line. Josh Simmons, frankly, the athleticism is there. It was the mental side and the technical side of the game that was needed refining as he came to Ohio State. He got better throughout last season, all through the regular season, and I thought really took some major strides, especially as a run blocker. And that left side of the offensive line, I'm really confident in run blocking wise. Seth McLaughlin was a great addition in terms of his experience, knowing how to set protections, being that centerpiece of the pocket to, give these quarterbacks time, give Will Howard time or Devin Brown, whoever wins that quarterback competition. We're leaning Will Howard at this point, I think, but it's still very much an open competition. Right guard, I'm still very concerned about right guard. I know sometimes it's easy in the offseason when there's a competition between guys who have talent like this to have a certain sense of security that, one of them's going to work out. But we've seen plenty of position competitions where at Ohio State where it was a competition because guys weren't ready yet or guys weren't at that level yet, and you're choosing between a few options that you're not fully confident in any of them. And right now, I think there are issues with each of the three players battling for that spot that they're going to have to develop and work through. Luke Montgomery, really liked his talent, really liked his athleticism coming out of high school. I think guard was always going to be the best spot for him long-term. Moving in from tackle made sense. But he's clearly still developing, and year two is like kind of borderline for an offensive lineman. You almost never see him play as freshman. It's a very developmental position. Tager Shabola, I think, is a little more natural at tackle, but makes a lot of sense at guard too. He's got the size for it. He's got the punch, got the construction where he can play either spot. Tager, it's the mental side of the game. I think he's got the athletic traits. He started to develop a lot in a lot of the technical components, although that still needs consistency too from what it seems like, what it sounds like. But the mental side of the game, I think when he was in that right tackle competition last year, we saw that there were times, there were plays he'd make a great block, and there were plays where he'd forget what his assignment was, So you have to find with Tagra, and he's had a great offseason approach from what coaches have said about it. And Hinsman obviously benched in the Cotton Bowl, but it does sound like he's responded well this spring. Still had his problems, definitely, as Ohio State center last year. And he'll need to take that next step. But again, a guy I like as a run blocker, especially the upside that Hinsman brings. And I think Chip Kelly is another piece of this that needs added into when you're talking about the confidence in this offensive line, because Chip Kelly knows how to scheme up an offensive line to play above its pay grade. He did it at UCLA. He's done it at other destinations. He knows how to simplify things, and he knows how to get defenses moving in a way that makes it easier to block them with all the window dressing and things he can do, and also knows how to develop physical running games that are offensive line oriented. So, all that being said, I'm cautiously optimistic, especially in terms of the running game of where Ohio State's offensive line can get to this year, but it is still definitely my top concern for the team.
Yeah, and with all that offensive line work that you just mentioned, we can also talk about how good the running back room is going to be to help supplement some of the stuff that Chip Kelly wants to do. I know you wrote about that this past weekend. With Travion Henderson and with Quinshon Judkins as your two running backs, you're not going to find a better running back in college football, running back room in college football. And the way that those two will be able to complement each other, maybe they go 1-2 punch. Maybe they're on the field at the same time. Maybe Chip Kelly throws out a wishbone formation, T formation. Maybe he throws out all these different concepts that we'll start to see his creative mind, developing with this team and with this roster as the year goes on to help that offensive line grow into its own. And I think that, if you didn't notice, guys, Andy is our resident expert on the offensive line with the way he was able to talk about specific aspects of that position room. I'm excited to see what Chip Kelly can do with that room and with this offense. And I think that maybe some of the concerns that we have about the offensive line this offseason and entering 2024 will start to ease a little bit as we see them beat down on some competition in the first couple of weeks. But of course, we'll really start to see them be tested, whether it's at Oregon or at Penn State against Michigan, and then so on and so forth. Yeah, and I'm just really excited to see what they can do.
Yeah, you flatter me calling me an expert. I played D4 Ohio high school football here. I'm not. I wouldn't have been recruited by Ohio Wesleyan, let alone Ohio State. So I'm an admirer of offensive line play. I think might be a more accurate assessment of my game knowledge there. But yeah, this is again a running game that I think you have to like the upside of, and it's going to depend on where that offensive line can get to, because those two running backs are going to be the best 1-2 punch in college football in all likelihood. I mean, they're two of probably the 5 best running backs, period, in college football. The way they're going to complement each other too, Travion, I think, giving you that big play component, that explosiveness that we've seen from him so many times, and developing a little bit more consistency. Quinshon, and breaking down his film, what I like is that he's going to be a guy who can really just get consistent chunks on a defense. He's got a constant leg drive, knows how to alter his body before the point of contact to kind of fall. He's always falling forward. I love a running back that always falls forward, and that's what Quinshon is really good at. He's not a big guy. He's not a power back in the sense of like he's 230 pounds or something, but he knows how to alter his body right before a defender hits him, so you're never squaring him up. And that's a really underrated aspect in short yardage, in those power running situations with guys. To draw on a comparison, I know a lot of Buckeye fans will hate, Blake Corum is great at this. Like when you, Michigan's running back, when you see your former running back now, when you see him in those short yardage situations, he was one of the best in college football at it all throughout his career, because he knows how to just shift his body a little bit before the defender hits him. It's not that he's big. He runs his feet through contact and avoids the direct square out from a defender. And I think Quinshon's really good at that. And you're going to see it pay dividends, and look to see them both get involved in the passing game a little bit too. I think safety valves are going to be important with a quarterback that, who's to say how much you're going to trust throwing downfield this year. Get the running backs involved in the passing game a little bit and let these athletes get out in space and make some noise. But again, bottom line, this is a roster that going forward, Ryan Day believes can win the national title. And, it's just a matter now of we're going to spend a few months prognosticating about it.
Yeah, the next couple of months, the way we talk about this roster, we really have to be careful not to be hurling expectations of the greatest of all time and what can this team do again, how's it compare to 2019 LSU and all these other great Ohio State teams that have come in the past. It's hard not to, because you really just look up and down this roster at the talent that they possess, and you want to just predict greatness for this team, but we know it's much more complicated than that.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of greatness, Marvin Harrison Jr. He's a great player. That's the segue. Not a great thing going on with him right now. So maybe not the best segue in that sense. But he has been sued by Fanatics for a breach of contract, which I think is probably the biggest overall piece of news that kind of hit the Ohio State football community this week, more so than Blake Woodby's decommitment, which we'll get to in a little bit, or the addition of Keenan Nelson Jr. When you talk about this Fanatics lawsuit, Chase, kind of break down the details a little bit of this thing. It's kind of convoluted and a little bit unprecedented to see a player get sued over what seems to be an NIL deal that was signed, not signed. There was a term sheet sent, but it might not be binding. I mean, what give people a sense of this thing?
Yeah, the Fanatics and Marvin Harrison Jr.'s relationship started sometime after his 2022 season, the year where he kind of came on the scene, was a unanimous All-American, and performed really well in the Peach Bowl before he was knocked out, unfortunately, for Ohio State's circumstances. But his relationship with them started then. Apparently, Fanatics was starting relationships with a lot of top-tier student athletes at that time, hoping to sign them to multi-year contracts where they would either sign helmets or jerseys or footballs, like playing cards, whatever they could sign. Fanatics wanted them to get their signature on memorabilia so that they could sell it on their website. And that's where this contract, this convoluted, like, where are we? This is where all of it starts. Is sometime around March 2023, around this time last year in the spring, they began a relationship where one party says, whether it's Fanatics, they say Marvin Harrison Jr. signed this contract that put him into a multi-year agreement to sell memorabilia. But at the same time, you have Marvin Harrison Jr. saying, I never signed this contract. I don't have any deals selling memorabilia. He actually has his own website called the Official Harrison Collection, where he sells his own memorabilia, his own signed footballs, helmets, all that good stuff. And so it's sort of a he said, she said kind of thing. And I imagine that now, as Fanatics has filed this lawsuit with the New York Supreme Court, that this lawsuit will be over rather quickly, because there has to be a piece of paper somewhere that either does or does not have Marvin Harrison Jr.'s signature on it. And I think that could be the thing, the piece of evidence, whatever you want to call it, that just puts an end to all of this process. It's been months long now where Marvin Harrison Jr. has had sort of this interesting approach toward his name, image, and likeness in the NFL. It took him a while to get his jersey up on the website, his Arizona Cardinals jersey. He apparently isn't signing a contract with the NFLPA that won't put his name, image, and likeness out with a handful of companies. I think it's over 80 actually, that the NFLPA wants to use his NIL for. And it's just all such an interesting process. I'm really not sure how it'll all be settled, but I do think that whenever it does get brought to court, it will end rather quickly. It just seems like something that has been hovering over Marvin Harrison Jr. for a really long time.
One of the things that's made the reporting on this so complicated generally is how heavily redacted the documents that Fanatics released from their lawsuit are. And so knowing exact details, pretty tough. NBC's Mike Florio did some good work on this, did some good legwork to find, and a point he made is that it was filed in a public court. We'll get the full unredacted document at some point to know what all is going on with this lawsuit. It seems from what he's been able to dig up that the that there wasn't a typical contract necessarily between Fanatics and Marvin Harrison Jr. that was signed, but there was essentially a term sheet Fanatics sent over that they considered binding. That is it actually legally binding is like something that's complicating this. And another thing too is what they included public statements that Marvin made that they claim misled the public about the nature of he and Fanatics' agreement or the lack thereof, basically. And that all comes from the Pat McAfee show in a retweet of a tweet the Pat McAfee show made, where basically they said they had a source from within Marvin Harrison Jr.'s camp that was saying there was no agreement between him and Fanatics, which they're claiming is a lie, and then that's the misinformation. So it's just funny how all of the sports media world has gotten kind of tied into this, and like you said, a very he said she said situation between Fanatics and Marvin Harrison Jr. that we'll get more details on, we'll know more about, and hopefully get some clarity over the coming weeks, because Fanatics is going, this is actually big time litigation. Fanatics is going after Harrison for millions of dollars in damages and trying to get him to hold up what they believe is the agreement that he agreed to and sign autographs for them on top of that, which is funny to me. But it's just a very complicated story that we'll be tracking over the coming weeks.
Yeah, and I'm not a lawyer, but I have watched Suits 2 times through, so I like to consider myself somewhat of an expert in the legal system. And I think one thing that could be happening here too, and this has been made public, I believe I read it in the ESPN article that reported much of the information that then we put on our website, that Fanatics could also just be using this lawsuit as a form of pressure to Harrison and Harrison's camp to just do whatever it is that he agreed to. It could be possible that term sheet or a contract that was sent over to him, that Marvin actually did sign it. But there may just be a misunderstanding, and maybe they're just trying to use this because knowing that ESPN, The Athletic, and all these other national outlets would report on it, to sort of apply pressure to Harrison to fulfill the contractual obligations that they wanted to fulfill in the first place, which it is possible. I don't know if that's actually their play here, but some people have theorized that is the case. If it does end up going to court, then it will be settled one way or the other. If it doesn't, then we'll probably see Harrison doing some deals with Fanatics here coming up soon, in some sort of settlement fashion, whatever they do to actually get this thing resolved. But yeah, just a very interesting scenario and situation for Marvin Harrison Jr. to be in. He seems like such a casual, like determined, organized, personal. Like he doesn't seem like someone that would get caught up in all this stuff. But then again, wide receivers, they do have that reputation in the NFL. So maybe he's buying into it a little bit, or somebody in his camp is influencing him too.
Yeah, I mean, you can't fault a guy certainly for doing what he does and when he did, and when he's on a certain stature, going out and trying to get the best deal possible that makes you the most money possible off of your name, your image, the what you've built for yourself in terms of your own reputation as a great football player. But yeah, just funny. It's odd to see him caught up in something like this. Moving on, I think the piece of negative news for Ohio State in terms of what will actually affect it on the field this week, they got a decommitment from 4-star cornerback Blake Woodby. But it's weird because top 10 corner in the class, you'd expect it to normally be a hit. When you lose a guy who's top 10 at his position in the country, but with the way Tim Walton's been piecing that class together, it doesn't feel like a loss at all, really, in terms of what they've got built there. They have the top 2 corners in the class committed already, and Devin Sanchez and Naeem Offord, and so you lose the guy who's ranked behind them. It just doesn't hurt as much, And on top of that, Dorian Brew, in-state, another 5-star corner prospect. The Buckeyes are very much in the thick of the race for him, and it feels like this is something that could open the door to his commitment. So I guess bottom line, Chase, is Tim Walton still goated?
Oh, absolutely. OG Walt still. It's a very tough situation for him and a very tough outcome. But as you mentioned, you still have the number 1 and number 2 overall cornerbacks in the class committed, top 5, top 10 overall prospects in the class. And as you mentioned, Dorian Brew is a prospect that Ohio State has had its eyes on for a very long time. It's not a guarantee that he commits. I don't think we're saying that here on this podcast that this is the domino that leads to another domino for Dorian Brew committing here. But it is definitely something that makes coming to Ohio State more enticing. If you're Brew, do you want to commit to a class and become the 4th cornerback commitment in the class, or do you want to become the 3rd? With Ohio State having a safety-driven defense still, but as we've seen, one of those safeties kind of be devoted more so to cornerback, at least this past season with Jordan Hancock and Jermaine Matthews getting some reps there at that nickel safety. Is Ohio State going to continue sort of using that as another place for cornerbacks, the very talented cornerback room, to get reps? And so I think that's part of Tim Walton's recruiting strategy for Brew, probably, is, hey, look, like down the line, it could be you 3 guys on the field. It could be you 3 locking up wide receivers for the other team week in and week out. And I think that seems like a much more enticing pitch, knowing that there's just 3 guys for 3 spots rather than 4 guys for 3.
Right. And that slot position has certainly pivoted to more of a cornerback position, the nickel there, with Jordan Hancock, with Jermaine Matthews Jr., as you said, but even with like depth down the line with Lorenzo Styles Jr. and the other players they're putting into that spot this year all seem to be corners. And, part of that might be a lack of safety depth and a lack of safety bodies that sort of fit that nickel build. Sort of bigger, can play in the box a little bit, and the physicality you need to do that. But I think also it speaks to, the evolution of offenses, and you need that guy who can just isolate in space and match up with a slot receiver the way Jordan Hancock can. And now you have that pitch to add another 5-star cornerback to your class potentially, or a 3rd cornerback just in general, to say, hey, this is another spot you can play in the defense. You're not just competing at these 2 spots here, and try to build a rapport, build a commitment that way. One of the last on the field things for Ohio State here is the physical field location of one of their games. Wrigley. They're going to play in the Cubs heralded stadium against Northwestern this season, while Northwestern constructs its new football stadium. This is going to be a pretty cool experience, I think, for us that, go to the road games, and I know personally I'm actually seeing Wrigley in a few weeks, going to a Chicago Cubs game with a buddy who lives in Chicago, but it'll be my second time seeing Wrigley. But seeing a football game at Wrigley is going to be a unique experience that I'm pretty excited for. Chase, is there reason for the general Ohio State fan who doesn't have plans to take a trek to the Chicago area that weekend, a reason for them to get excited about this?
I think so, yeah. I don't know what the ticket prices will be for this game. I'm imagining, given the lack of seating available, that they'll probably be pretty expensive. But, I mean, how often do you get to watch Ohio State football play in a non-football stadium? I don't know. I could be wrong about this, but I don't know if there's been more than maybe 3, 4, 5 times that Ohio State's played in a stadium like that. And most of them happened way back in the day when Ohio State would play in these multi-purpose stadiums. I know they had a game a long, long time ago in Cleveland Municipal Stadium where the Browns and then the Indians played. I know they played a long time ago at the Polo Grounds in New York City, which was where the New York baseball giants played and the Yankees played for a little bit. So it seems like this is sort of a once in a generation thing where you may be able to see Ohio State play a baseball game or play a football game in a baseball stadium. If you have the opportunity to go, I would highly recommend it. I think that would be a memory that would last a lifetime. And I think, it's Ohio State playing Northwestern. When's the last time Ohio State's lost to Northwestern? When's the last time Ohio State had a bad game against Northwestern that wasn't affected by 100-mile-per-hour wind and hail and rain and all those factors? So, I think it'll be fun for Ohio State fans if you get the opportunity to go. And even if you get to watch it at home, I think they'll do some pretty creative things to get everyone engaged.
Yeah, just that setting, even, it's always like how a football field gets planted on a baseball field, and sort of like it's always that like fits in kind of odd. Like whenever you watch the Pinstripe Bowl, for those of you who are fellow, sicko bowl enjoyers, play that in Yankee Stadium, and see like just, it's always cool to me just how they plant a football field in the outfield, and it's sort of, it becomes a misshapen stadium around it. It's this really cool effect. And you add in the ivy and the walls and just all the tradition that goes with Wrigley. I think it's something to be excited about. Just a neat little thing coming up if you're a Buckeye fan. Moving on from just Ohio State, Big Ten at large, Chase, raking in the big bucks. Recent report by Sportico found that the Big Ten had $880 million reported on its tax returns for the 2023 fiscal year. Fiscal years for these purposes run from July 1st to June 30th. So that's from July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. In that time span, $880 million in revenues for the Big Ten, exceeding the SEC's $853 million. And that is before the new TV deal kicked in for the Big Ten on July 1st, 2023. So you're talking about leading the nation's conferences in revenue generation before your new 7-year, $7 billion media rights deal takes effect. It was a $60 million distribution to each school after expenses were retracted from that $880 million. But now more than ever, Chase, college football is a business, and business is booming in the Big Ten, with 4 power brands to join the conference next year in Washington, USC, UCLA, and Oregon.
Yeah, it becomes clear why conferences have adjusted when hiring their commissioners and hiring the commissioner's support staff to be business-minded, business-oriented people. The money that is being passed around from TV, from media, from all of that sort of digitalized content or conferences is absurd. You saying that this $880 million number comes without the $7 billion deal that the Big Ten signed that will include, games on CBS and on NBC and Peacock and Fox. And I mean, you can go down the line. The Big Ten is going to be everywhere, and it's going to be anything everyone sees. And I think the reason for that, or the reason why, there's been such a big buy-in, is because of how marketable college football has become. It's probably, I don't know, I don't want to make too audacious of a claim, but college football may be the number 2 most popular sport in America, behind only the NFL. The NFL is bulletproof. Is college football number 2, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think numbers would back that up in terms of attendance, TV ratings, revenue generation, all those sorts of things. Football is the most popular sport, and it goes NFL, college football, 1, 2, like that. And certainly from my perspective, and I think, like I said, TV ratings and attendance and all that would back it up.
Right, absolutely. I think that's kind of been the growing narrative for a long time, is that college football has reached a point where it is even more popular than the NBA, than the MLB, than the NHL, and then also the MLS. Like, Americans want football, and they want more and more of it. And so I think the reason why we keep seeing these numbers increase is because TV companies know that. They know that they're going to get millions of viewers, especially for Ohio State football games. When you look at teams like Michigan, Penn State, USC, Washington, Oregon, and then you have even more a tier below that of reputable brands that may not draw as much of a TV audience, but still have enough people that are going to be interested in watching those teams perform. It's incredible to me that the Big Ten is already at this almost $900 million number, and knowing that next year, once that TV deal applies, we're probably going to be looking at the Big Ten as having more than $1 billion reported on their tax returns. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah. And just the reason, too, that you see these teams from the Pac-12 want to jump into the Big Ten Conference, and even like in the SEC's case, who is drawing in similar numbers, Big Ten now exceeding them, but the SEC drawing in similar numbers and has been the top conference in years past for these revenues. Why teams are jumping ships from the other conferences to get into these. Football has always been a money-driven game in a lot of ways. That's what happens when you have all this interest that we talk about, when it is the second most popular sport behind the NFL, or second most popular sports league. It's all football, I guess, but second most popular sports league behind the NFL. And NIL's getting involved. Profit sharing might be coming down the line, is probably coming down the line. I think if you talk to certain key people like Gene Smith, the revenue is a very, very important side of this. And the more distribution you can get from your conference, the better you're going to be able to sustain your program in the long term, even upgrade those facilities and feed other athletic departments, other athletics teams outside the football team, the basketball teams, which also generate revenues, but those other sports that you want to fund that aren't revenue generating per se, the way to fuel them is also through these distributions. So when you see these revenues increase, it's good for the whole of the conference's athletics, and it's more reason why these four brands that jumped in the Big Ten this season are doing so. And, it's also going to help, I think, establish the Big Ten and the SEC are rising above the rest as the two powers that might shape the future of college football in general. And now we see them on this sort of equal playing field when it comes to the insane numbers in terms of money that they're generating.
Look, you brought it up, and I think it's worthy of its own at least small conversation. The revenue sharing has to happen. It has to. You can't have the Big Ten and most likely the SEC reporting $1 billion in revenue on their tax returns and then not be paying the players that make it the product that is worthy of that money. It would be wild to me for the Big Ten, the SEC, forever. I don't know who makes these decisions. It's above my pay grade. But whoever makes these decisions, you cannot tell me that the student athletes don't deserve a cut of it. That is a ton of money, even if it's a couple $1,000s per player. It's something that has needed to happen for a long time, and it would be nice to see the NCAA or whatever governing body get out ahead of it. They've been so behind, whether it's on NIL or whether it's on transfer portal. It just seems like the NCAA always just wants to sit on its hands and wait for somebody else to solve their problems for it. It would just be nice to see them get out ahead of this and just make it something worth the school's while in helping them figure out what's the best model to get these players a cut of the revenue, because that's so much money. And I think that the players who make these leagues and make these this product of college football worth its while deserve something of it.
Right. And I think at least NIL has given a path for a lot of star players to be well compensated. Who knows how much it's a factor for, guy number 80 on the roster on a MAC school who deserves a cut of the revenue he generates for his team. You look at Ohio State stars and think, these guys are getting 6, even 7-figure NIL deals, and, say, well, why is profit sharing needed? It's for that person. And the NCAA was so far behind on NIL, like you said, where it was basically legislators that forced their hand to allow what's really, to me, a basic economic freedom that everyone else had forever except college athletes, where if I'm popular enough, I can go out and make an endorsement because someone just wants to pay me to sponsor their product or to sign autographs. Like, that's not impermissible benefit. Now, of course, there's been some other bad actors that have entered with NIL. It's been used in a lot of ways just as a direct way to pay players. that is obviously, not necessarily what it was intended for, but at the same time, you can never fault a player for wanting to provide for his family, especially a lot of these guys who don't come from great economic circumstances. And on top of that, for so long, players were unjustly not given a cut of this. And, there are people that say, well, you can't put a price on a free education. True to some extent, but like, do you just want that money to go back in the university pockets? Hundreds of millions of dollars we're talking here. Like, be real in any work environment. And I'm sorry if I come across a little, I don't mean to push this too hard, but in a work environment, you deserve a fair share of what you generate for any company. And this is a business now. And, I think profit sharing is that recognition of a business. The good news is, I think, from the conversation we had with Gene Smith and the future of college athletics upon his, as his retirement is going through here that we were a part of, and then through what you just see around the public, the NCAA doesn't feel like going forward, it's really going to be the governing body dictating these things. There are purposes the NCAA is still filling, but a lot of the changes that are coming in college football in terms of structure, in terms of something like this, are going to be coming from new leadership sources, whether that's the Big Ten and SEC unifying their might and kind of flexing their muscle, as we're seeing with some of the college football playoff realignment talks. We've started to see talks of a super league, which might totally sever the connection with the NCAA if that were to happen. And all this stuff about the change that's coming in college football, it doesn't feel like it's going to be dictated by the NCAA anymore. And it's because they were so far behind the eight ball for so many years, not even letting players have extra money on the side that schools could give them just for cost of living. That was a battle. And Gene Smith talked about that, how hard that was to get past. There was a leadership vacuum that has partially been resolved with a change in who the president was, but it was too late. And Gene Smith talked about that. And that's why I don't think you're going to see the NCAA at the forefront of these changes unless something drastically shifts in how the NCAA operate. But we could spend a whole hour, I think, talking about this topic and paying players and profit sharing and NIL. I think it's best we move on and address a couple of other smaller news items here before we wrap things up. Big shout out to Nadine Muzerall, the maybe the best coach at Ohio State outside perhaps Holly Vargo Brown. The synchronized swimming legend over there. But Nadine rightfully getting a contract extension from Ohio State. What she's built in terms of taking a sport that has really super established defined powers that was super impenetrable, it seemed, to upset the power balance of women's hockey. She put a new national player on the scene in 5 years at Ohio State when she was taking over for a program that was well under 500 when she got there. So what she's built, winning 2 national championships now, I think this contract more than deserved for Nadine.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly as you said. What she's built with the women's hockey program has been incredible to witness. And the way that she has continued to influence not only the sport, but the university, Ohio State specifically, with the investment that Ohio State has made in the women's hockey program has paid dividends. Ohio State, for the talent that the program possesses, has been playing in that rinky-dink OSU ice rink forever. And, I think Gene Smith and Ross Bjork will continue and carry the torch from here, recognized that we have something special in Nadine Muzerall, and we have something special in this program, and they deserve to play in an arena that can seat more than 900 people and can bring the masses and can make Columbus, who's already a wonderful hockey town with the Columbus Blue Jackets being here, even though they never really deliver on the fan attendance and the fan passion that exists around the franchise. It's given people in Columbus and Ohio State fans across the country a way to invest their love in hockey in a program that delivers greatness year in and year out. Especially these past 3 years that Ohio State has made the national championship game and has won 2 of them, has knocked off Wisconsin, multiple times, whether it's in the regular season, whether it's in the final face-off for their conference, or whether it's on the national stage in the Frozen Four. This is a program that's here to stay, especially with Nadine Muzerall at the helm.
Absolutely. And then, the team that has been at the top of its sport for a long time, but just can't seem to get across those last couple hurdles is the tennis team. Fell in the national semifinals to TCU this week after a close bout in the quarterfinals. This was a senior-laden tennis team that had come close to national titles year after year with this group of players, this core that has been here for a long time. And now they're going to lose a bunch of seniors. This was their sort of run to try and capture. They've won indoor national titles, but that big prize at the end, the NCAA national championship, has eluded this program for its entire existence. And unfortunately, this wasn't the year to pay it off. Tennis is a hard sport to predict match to match. You have a lot of things, little tiny things that can go wrong. Guys fall behind in a set, and guys lose matches where they're not expected to, but definitely a heartbreaking loss in the national semifinals for the tennis team.
Yeah, the program has been so dominant for so long that you kind of wonder, when will they win it all? And it seemed like this was maybe the year that they would finally break through and do it. They were the number one overall seed. They'd only lost once in the regular season. I believe it was to Texas, at Texas. So they were, fairly dominant as always in the regular season. They kind of hit a bump in the road facing Columbia in the NCAA tournament, where you maybe had some concerns moving forward, like how would that affect their stamina going into Saturday's match against TCU. And it seemed like that kind of was their undoing. They had another, I think it was a 4-hour match against TCU. That's a long match coming off the heels of a 3-hour plus match against Columbia only a couple of days earlier. It's just tough to see Ohio State continue to be knocking at the door and not being able to push through it, not being able to break it down. But as you mentioned, that's just kind of tennis sometimes. It really is a sport where you don't know the exact results. It's hard to predict, and you don't really ever have consistently dominant programs. It seems to be each year there's a new one that rises to the top. So maybe a couple years down the road, once Ohio State rebuilds its roster, maybe then again we'll be talking about them as the program that could be on the cusp of winning their first title in a long time, or maybe the first title overall. I mean, definitely the first one since Ty Tucker took over.
It's been a long time coming. One of many summer sports that is sort of wrapping up in this season for Ohio State. We'll be here to cover some of that ongoings, and obviously what's happening with the football program, what's happening with Marvin Harrison Jr. Throughout the week and throughout these coming weeks on 11 Warriors. So thank you for joining us here on this latest episode of Real Pod Wednesdays. For Chase Brown, I'm Andy Anders. Thank you all for listening.